footnotes for everyone to understand. But when you apply this literary principle to the foundational concepts and rituals, such as the pillars of Islam, then things get a little dicey. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, I admit the story of the she-camel, that's a story that existed before the Quran. Obviously, there was no need to explain it because people were quite familiar with the legend and with the story. But when it comes to the very core of Islam, to say that these things are simply Jewish, Christian, or pagan myths and legends and stories, or Arbery translates in one place fairy tales, to say that would be to shake the very concept of revelation within Islamic theology. And of course, I acknowledge that the concept of inspiration in Islam is not at all in any way to be parallel to the concept of inspiration of the Bible. Christians believe that God used men, as Peter said, holy men of God, being moved by the Holy Spirit, spoke as God gave them utterance. So the Bible was not something that was brought down. It was something that God enabled these men to write. So thus we talk about the book of Isaiah. We talk about the Gospel of John. But when we're dealing with the Quran, this is something that was brought down out of heaven and that was revealed by the angel to Muhammad, in which he recited what he saw. So that the idea that we can treat the Quran like we can treat the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Book of Mormon. For example, I have written articles on the history of the origins of the material in the Book of Mormon. The reason the Book of Mormon sounds like the Bible is that there are several thousand passages taken from the King James translation. Now, since the Book of Mormon supposedly was written before 1611, and it comes from periods in which, of course, there was no Elizabethan English, how do you end up with an inspired book that has the King James in it? And so, to discuss the historical origins of the material of the Book of Mormon, or you go and discuss it when it comes to the Vedas or whatever it is, now we come to the issue of the historical origins of those central, and we recognize this is very sensitive, and it is not our intent to offend or inflame. It's simply, as someone who studies literature and as someone who is devoted over 30 years of his life and has earned degrees looking at the historical origins of things, I feel I can't exempt the Quran from the same kind of literary analysis that I apply to every other book. And for this reason, even when we come to those pillars of Islam, I have to come to the conclusion that they, like many of the innocent stories, were simply the legends and the folk tales. They were the things that were well known by the contemporaries in Arabia at that time. And this is why these things could be referred to not as something new and startling. Instead, they were referred to as something that people were familiar with. They were often introduced, as we will see, just by referring to the name, not even attempting to explain because there was no need. Now, if you look in the Quran itself, you will find that I am not the inventor or I am not the originator of this observation. This is why when someone wants to have a session just to attack me personally, it really doesn't do any good to use that type of logical fallacy and ad hominem approach, because I never started Christianity or Islam, and I doubt very seriously that anything you will hear on any of these nights is anything's original with me. As a scholar, I simply study the works of other people, and I depend upon those who likewise study these things. And if you look in Surah chapter 25, you will find here that those who were listening to Muhammad as he explained to them the Quran, this is what it says in verse 4. But the unbelievers say, and let me put you up one of the translations, which I think is a good paraphrase. This is what was said by some of those who were listening to Muhammad. So we're back in the 7th century. These were people who were alive